I'm doing a video today about the front Lokka installation and the differential drop bushing installation. The Lokka is a specific brand name on an automatic locker, which is a device in the front differential that forces power to go evenly to the front left and front right tires. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how an open differential works, I suggest you do a separate YouTube or Google search to learn those basics. I installed my Lokka several years ago, and I did not get video of the installation, but I did take several photos and I made a write-up that I posted on the message boards and forums. I'm going to be posting those photos and narrating on top of them and supplementing with some additional video footage. The first step is to get the front differential out, which is easier said than done. Underneath your oil filter and your alternator, underneath your center link and above your front sway bar, there's going to be two bolted joints. One bushing is attached to the front differential, one bushing is attached to a bracket on that cross member. You have two more bushings that are going to be near the pivot point of your lower control arm, right near your torsion bar anchor. Between your upper and lower control arms, there's going to be the ends of your CV axles that have 6 bolts that hold them to a bolted flange. Lastly, you have 4 bolts that hold the front drive shaft into the input flange of the differential. Because you're removing the entire differential from the overall vehicle anyway, it's a convenient time to do differential drop bushings, which are just bushings that have an offset hole in them, and this allows your differential to sit down lower, which helps maintain better CV axle alignment on lifted vehicles. However, it is a complete pain in the ass, and I don't really recommend it, but I'll go ahead and include the installation process for those as well. Removing the differential is as simple as undoing those bolted joints and safely removing it from the vehicle, but there are a few tricks. Firstly, any of the bolts that are going to be on a rotating flange are going to have some of the bolts that are easy to access from underneath the vehicle, but then the other bolts are going to be on the top side of the circle, which is going to be difficult to get a wrench on it. You're going to have to experiment with rotating the drive shafts by either putting the transfer case into neutral or too high or 4-wheel drive, or experimenting with locking and unlocking your front hub so you can rotate the CV axle so that you have wrench access. The 4 bolts that hold the front drive shaft in on my vehicle had red Loctite, and I had to use a torch to be able to loosen it up with the wrench without stripping out the bolt head. The front cross member that the 2 bushings bolt into stays inside the vehicle, but the rear cross member is actually attached to the differential. So when you lower it down from the vehicle, it's easier to lower the rear of the differential down first and then kind of rotate it downwards. I recommend using some type of transmission jack, or I took an old scissor jack and I welded a platform on top of it so I could lower it. Lastly, there is a vent hose that just has a normal type nipple fitting on it, and that's pretty easy to get to with the needle nose plier to undo the hose clamp and disconnect the hose. The front diff has a drain plug and a fill plug that can be removed with a 1/2-inch square drive wrench. Use a 14mm wrench to remove all of the bolts on the diff cover and make sure you have a fresh gasket for reassembly. Go ahead and drain the fluid. The driver's side flange that the CV axle bolted to will have a single 14mm bolt that holds the axle in place into the diff. The passenger side is going to have a flange that has 4 bolts that hold a square flange together. You're going to want new gaskets on each of these for reassembly. Now the ring gear, the bearing caps, and the carrier are exposed. Use a 17mm wrench to remove the 4 bolts on the bearing caps. With the bearing caps removed, you can remove the carrier from the overall differential housing. It does take a little bit of finesse to unmesh the ring gear from the pinion, but with a pry bar or a rubber mallet, you should be able to break it free. Underneath each bearing cap is going to be a bearing race, which is a taper cone that the bearings actually roll on. There's also going to be a washer, and the washer is specially sized to control the in-place side to side of the carrier. You need to make sure the washers go back to the same side you remove them from. Go ahead and remove the ring gear, which is a 17mm wrench, but it is a fairly high torque bolted joint. You're going to need a bench vise to either hold your carrier steady or an impact wrench that can apply a sudden burst of torque. I went ahead and marked my ring gear so that the holes lined up to the exact same spot on the carrier for reassembly. The backside of the carrier has a small hole that allows you to access a roll pin that retains the cross shaft. A roll pin is not solid, it is hollow in the middle, so you need to have a punch that is the full diameter of the hole. If your punch is tapered, you probably will not be able to drive the pin far enough, so I had to use a 3/16 drill bit and hammer it out with the blunt edge. It's important to note that you don't need to fully remove the pin, you just need to hammer it out of the way so that it is no longer retaining the cross shaft. Once the cross shaft is removed, the spider gears will come out pretty easily, and those will also have a conical washer on the backside. These gears are no longer going to be used with the Lokka. You can now remove your axle gears, which are identifiable by the splines in the middle of the gear. One of the gears has a nut that is pressed into those splines. You may remember earlier when you removed an axle shaft that there was one side that was held in by a single 14mm bolt, and this nut is where that bolt threaded into. You are no longer going to use these gears with the Lokka, but you will hammer out the nut and transfer it over to the Lokka axle gears. The Lokka kit comes with 2 axle gears, 2 cam gears, and 2 spacers, which is what I drew in blue. The instruction sheet will also give you some clearances that you need to measure with the feeler gauge, and it will also have some instructions on how to do a function check to make sure that it unlocks as it's supposed to. I'm not going to go into the details of these individual instructions, but you need to reference the sheet that comes with your kit. There were also some thrust washers on the back side of the axle gears, so you want to make sure you keep those on the same side of the differential that you remove them from. Go ahead and take some grease and stick them to the back side of the Lokka axle gears. Now if you go ahead and press that nut into the splines of the axle gears and try to assemble it into the carrier, you're not going to have enough room in that opening in the carrier to fit all of the gears. Now I did something silly like take a grinder to the back flange of that nut to try and reduce the thickness so there would not be that interference, but that's not the best way to go. The secret to installing everything in that tight carrier window is going to be to start with the axle gears without the nut pressed into place. That nut can then go inside the spacer on that side, and that spacer goes inside the cam gear. That way when you go into the window of the carrier, it's not taking up any usable space to fit the parts through. To be able to get that nut seated on the splines, you can try and thread the bolt in there and catch it by the threads and pull it into the splines, or you can get it lined up on one side and then take a socket on the end of an extension and tap it in place with a hammer. The last thing to do is to align the slots in the hole so you can put in the pins and the springs. The pin goes into the hole with the flat end of the pin going inside the hole and the nipple feature pointed into the slot. The springs are a little stiff, so you got to be careful not to lose an end of the spring and let it go flying. Now you're just reassembling everything the exact opposite way that you took it apart, and I'll put the Torx up at the end. One thing to note is to get the ring gear fully seated onto the carrier, I did use a rubber mallet to kind of tap it in place, and then I used 2 bolts on opposite edges to catch the threads, and use the threads to press it into place. If you are not doing the differential drop bushings, go ahead and use Teflon tape on the drain and fill plugs, bolt everything back together with fresh gaskets, and refill with 75W90 gear oil of your choice. If you are going to go ahead with the differential drop bushings, I recommend you reconsider, because honestly, it's a huge pain in the ass, and if you're that concerned about CV axle alignment, you can just drop your suspension lift by 3/8 of an inch. But if you are going to go through with it, remove the 2 bolts that hold that rear crossmember to the differential body. Go back to your vehicle where that front crossmember is still in place, and remove the 2 bolts that hold that bracket and bushing into the crossmember. Now you can work on it on a bench. There's no real delicate way to go about removing them, but the bushing does consist of an inner steel sleeve, an outer ring of rubber, and an outer steel sleeve that holds it all together. I took a drill and drilled a bunch of holes through the rubber along the outside of the circle. I used a combination of torches, hammers, razor blades, screwdrivers, punches, whatever destructive means necessary to try and chunk out the center of that bushing. You want to be able to get the rubber out of the bushing so you can work on that outer steel sleeve. This is the end result that you're looking for. You can see that there's still that outer steel sleeve inside the bushing holder, and there's still some rubber stuck to it, but now you have room to get tools on the inside of the bushing holder. The best method is to go ahead and put a hacksaw through the center of the bushing holder, or a reciprocating saw like a Sawzall. Try and cut a couple relief cuts that go through just the steel sleeve but not through the outer wall of the bushing holder. Here you can actually see there's a little notch on the outside of the bushing holder, which should theoretically allow you to get either a screwdriver or a punch or a chisel right on the edge of it and try and hammer it down. What ends up happening a lot of times is that the bushing outer sleeve is going to fold over on itself, which can cause it to get wedged even further into the overall bushing holder. I tried to avoid this if at all possible. Once you have those steel sleeves removed, you can install your differential drop bushings. The differential drop bushings are going to consist of 8 flange urethane bushings with an offset hole that has a steel sleeve that goes through them. For the 3 bushings that are attached to the differential body, you want the steel sleeve and hole to be on the top side of the bushing holder. For the singular bushing that is on that bracket, you want the hole to be on the bottom side of the bushing holder. Those urethane bushings are going to have part of the flange cut off, which allows it to sit more flush to the L-shaped bracket. Yeah, so this doesn't seem so bad, right? A guy on YouTube talking about it and showing some pictures. Well, everything about this process is bad. Unless you have an actual bushing press and the proper tools to do this, it's a complete pain, and everybody that I know that has done this has agreed with me. The removal of the stock bushings is a complete pain and will take forever. Even once you're done with that, you're not out of the woods, because the urethane bushings of the Diff drop kit are extremely tight fitting. You can try to freeze them, you can try and lube them up with some grease or oil, but it's still not going to be easy to put them in place. And now that you have two half bushings with offset holes, you have to make sure that they're both clocked 100% identically so you can get that steel sleeve driven through without pushing the bushing out the other side. Even once you think you're done, you still might not be done, because have fun with that disappointment when you go to lift your differential into place only to find out that only 2 or 3 of your bolt holes actually line up because one of them was clocked differently about a half a degree. So I will close by saying that the Lokka, hands down 100% without a doubt, is the absolute best mod I have ever done for off-road performance. By driving both of your front tires all the time, you get 2 main benefits. One is that you now don't really have to do a bump and run technique like you do with an open diff. You can crawl over it in a controlled fashion, which reduces the probability of breaking tie rods and front end steering components. The second major benefit is the fact that now the limitations of an independent front suspension aren't really hurting you, because you don't really need a lot of flex to keep both tires on the ground if you're going to drive both tires no matter what anyway. The one thing that I will caution is that having a Lokka installed will cause steering feedback and a tighter steering feel when you're in four-wheel drive, especially on high traction surfaces. When I'm off-roading on a dirt trail and a tight turn is coming up, it does take a little bit of finesse to plan ahead and take my foot off the gas pedal and allow the differential to ratchet while I make the turn. A lot of people complain about this with snowy conditions, but honestly it's not a problem if there's snow on the ground, because your tires are going to slip and you're not going to get the feedback. To me, I think the problem is more so people that like to engage four-wheel drive out of an abundance of caution anytime the roads are even just patchy with snow. If the roads are mostly patchy, I don't engage four-wheel drive at all, but the solution that I typically will do is I'll leave my manually locking hubs locked, and then I'll go into 4 high as needed, and then you can shift on the fly from 4 high back to 2 high. So once the roads are kind of clear and patchy, I'll shift out of four-wheel drive, and you just got to make sure that your transfer case disengages so the Lokka doesn't give you steering feedback. So thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoy the content of these videos, and comment below if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos.